Sometimes a man must lose everything he thought he was to discover who he was always meant to become. Wyatt Kane's Colt .45 barked twice in the Arizona desert twilight, dropping the two men who had Nayeli pinned against the red rock outcropping. The Apache woman's obsidian eyes met his across the smoky clearing, and in that moment, the outlaw's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. At 32, Wyatt had been running from the law for 8 years, his wanted posters scattered across 3 territories. The desert was his home, solitude his companion, and survival his only creed. Nayeli was everything he wasn't connected to: family, tradition, and a sacred way of life he'd never understood. What began as a chance rescue would transform a godless drifter into a sacred husband, prove that love could bridge any cultural divide, and show that sometimes the most unlikely unions create the strongest bonds when forged in the fires of shared danger and mutual respect. Arizona Territory, August 1879. The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, its harsh beauty broken only by towering saguaro cacti and jagged mountain ranges that rose like ancient fortresses from the valley floor. This was Apache country, sacred land, where ancient traditions thrived despite the encroachment of white settlers and the U.S. Army's relentless campaigns to force native peoples onto reservations. The Chiricahua Apache band, led by Nayeli's father, Coshice's nephew Tase, had managed to maintain their independence in the remote canyons and hidden valleys where their ancestors had lived for generations. Here, the old ways persisted: the sacred ceremonies, the warrior codes, and the spiritual beliefs that connected the Apache people to the land they considered their mother. Wyatt Kane had been born William Prescott in Missouri to a preacher father who believed in salvation through suffering, and a mother who died when he was 12. His father's brutal discipline and religious fanaticism had driven him to run away at 16, stealing the family horse and his father's life savings. The first man he killed was a bounty hunter who tracked him to Kansas. The second was a sheriff who tried to arrest him for the first killing. By 25, he was wanted in 5 states for robbery, murder, and cattle rustling. Now he lived like a ghost in the desert, surviving on whatever he could hunt, steal, or win at cards in the rough border towns. His only possessions were his horse Thunder, his father's worn Bible, which he couldn't bring himself to discard despite his hatred of religion, 2 Colt .45s, and a Winchester rifle. He trusted no one, loved nothing, and expected to die alone with his boots on. The desert suited him: harsh, unforgiving, and indifferent to the dreams and failures of lesser men. What made Wyatt different from other outlaws was his strict personal code. He never killed unnecessarily, never harmed women or children, and never broke his word once given. These principles, inherited from his mother's gentle influence before her death, had kept him from becoming the monster his father's preaching had warned against. His accuracy with firearms was legendary, but his restraint was even more remarkable. He could have been a much richer and more feared outlaw, but something in his core refused to cross certain lines. The conflict began when Wyatt witnessed Nayeli's assault by 2 white drifters who had tracked her away from her village while she gathered medicinal herbs. His intervention was instinctive. The same code that had guided him for years demanded that he protect the innocent, regardless of race or circumstance. But saving Nayeli created complications he couldn't have anticipated. She was badly injured and needed medical attention that only her people could provide. Taking her to a white settlement would mean exposing himself to arrest, but leaving her in the desert meant certain death. His choice to escort her home would place him in the heart of Apache territory, where his reputation as a white outlaw might make him as dangerous to her people as he was to the law. The greatest conflict, however, was internal. Could a man who had spent 8 years rejecting all human connection find meaning in a relationship that demanded complete emotional and spiritual surrender? But Wyatt was about to discover that some debts can only be repaid through bonds that transcend culture, law, and everything he thought he knew about himself. The decision to take Nayeli home began when Wyatt realized the extent of her injuries. The two attackers had done more than assault her. They had beaten her severely, leaving her with possible internal bleeding and a deep gash on her forehead that would need immediate treatment. Her whispered words in Apache were incomprehensible to him, but her meaning was clear. She needed help only her people could provide. "Easy now," Wyatt said softly, cradling her against his chest as he lifted her onto Thunder's saddle. "I'm going to get you home." The promise was made without thought for consequences. Entering Apache territory meant risking his life. The Apache had no love for white men, and his reputation as an outlaw would hardly recommend him as a savior. But something in Nayeli's eyes, a combination of pain and trust, had awakened protective instincts he'd thought long dead. The journey to her village would take 2 days through some of the most dangerous terrain in the territory. Apache scouts would be watching long before he reached the settlement, and his survival would depend on Nayeli's ability to vouch for him while barely conscious. Every step took him further from the familiar desert paths and closer to a confrontation with forces he didn't understand but couldn't avoid. "You better be worth dying for," he murmured to the unconscious woman, though he already knew she was. Wyatt's preparation for entering Apache territory drew on 8 years of survival skills and an intuitive understanding of honor codes that transcended cultural boundaries. He cleaned and bound Nayeli's wounds with strips torn from his own shirt, using techniques learned from Army medics during his brief stint as a cavalry scout before turning outlaw. His approach to the Apache village had to balance caution with clear intent. Riding in armed and alert might be seen as threatening. Approaching unarmed would be suicide if the Apache decided he was an enemy. His solution was to holster his weapons but keep them visible, demonstrating that he came in peace but was capable of defending himself if necessary. "Listen," he said to Nayeli during one of her brief, conscious moments. "When we get to your people, you need to tell them I helped you. My life's going to depend on your word, and yours might depend on how fast they can heal you." Nayeli's response was a weak squeeze of his hand and a whispered word in Apache that he hoped meant agreement rather than goodbye. Her condition was deteriorating, and he knew that time was running out for both of them. The final miles to the Apache village tested every survival skill Wyatt had learned in 8 years of outlaw life. He had to navigate by instinct through terrain he'd never seen, while carrying a woman who might die before he could get her help, all while knowing that Apache scouts were probably watching his every move through rifle sights. The Apache village appeared suddenly as Wyatt crested a ridge, hidden in a canyon that seemed to materialize from the desert floor. Wickiups and cooking fires spoke of a people who lived in harmony with the harsh landscape, while armed warriors positioned at strategic points made it clear that this was no defenseless settlement. The reception committee consisted of 6 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, and their weapons ready. Wyatt's first step was to dismount slowly, keeping his hands visible while supporting Naeli's unconscious form. The universal language of a wounded person transcended tribal boundaries, and he saw recognition rather than hostility in the warrior's eyes. "She was attacked by 2 white men," Wyatt said clearly, though he wasn't sure any of them spoke English. "I killed them and brought her home." The response came from an elderly Apache woman who approached with the confidence of a healer. Her examination of Naeli was swift and professional, her commands in Apache sending warriors running for medicinal supplies and summoning others to carry the injured woman to safety. "You did well," she said to Wyatt in accented but clear English, "but now you must face her father. He will decide if you live or die for what you have done today." The words were both reassurance and warning, marking the end of the rescue and the beginning of a reckoning that would determine whether Wyatt's act of mercy would be rewarded or punished by people whose justice operated by rules he didn't understand. But Wyatt was about to learn that among the Apache. Some acts of courage carry obligations that last a lifetime. The first challenge came when Tazai, Naeli's father and the band's spiritual leader, declared that, by saving his daughter's life, Wyatt had incurred a sacred debt that could only be repaid through marriage according to ancient Apache law. The pronouncement came after 3 days of healing ceremonies, during which Wyatt had been kept under guard while tribal elders debated his fate. "Among our people," Taze explained through his English-speaking wife, Maria, "when a man saves a woman's life at great risk to his own, the spirits have chosen them for each other. You are now her sacred husband, bound by laws older than your people's presence in this land." Wyatt's shock was complete and immediate. He had expected gratitude, perhaps safe passage through Apache territory, but never this level of spiritual obligation to people whose customs he barely understood. The second escalation occurred when Wyatt's initial attempts to refuse the arrangement were met with explanations that rejection would dishonor not just Naeli, but the entire spiritual framework that governed Apache life. His rescue had been witnessed by the spirits, and denying their will would bring catastrophe to the entire band. "You cannot undo what has been done," Maria explained as Wyatt struggled with the implications. "The ceremony will take place when Naeli is strong enough to participate. Until then, you are under the protection and authority of this family." The cultural prison felt as confining as any jail cell he'd ever occupied, but the stakes extended beyond personal freedom to the welfare of people who had shown him mercy when they could have chosen vengeance. The crisis deepened when word of Wyatt's presence in the Apache village reached the outside world. attracting bounty hunters who saw an opportunity to collect the substantial reward on his head. The arrival of armed white men in Apache territory created a volatile situation that threatened both Wyatt's freedom and the village's security. The Apache found themselves caught between their obligation to protect their new son-in-law and their need to avoid confrontation with white authorities who might use the incident as justification for military action against the entire band. The external pressure intensified when a federal marshal named Clayton arrived with a posse of 6 men, demanding that the Apache surrender Wyatt for transport to trial in Tucson. The marshal's presence raised the stakes beyond personal freedom to potential conflict between the U.S. government and one of the few Apache bands still maintaining their independence. That man is a wanted criminal, Marshal Clayton declared during a tense meeting with Taizé. Federal law requires his immediate surrender, regardless of any tribal customs or ceremonies. The confrontation exposed the fundamental conflict between two systems of law and justice, the Apache's spiritual obligations and the U.S. government's civil authority. Taizé's response was dignified but firm. "This man is now our son. We do not surrender family to enemies." The standoff created a diplomatic crisis that attracted attention from territorial officials, army commanders, and newspaper reporters who saw the story as symbolic of the broader conflict between indigenous peoples and American expansion. The peaceful Apache village became the center of a controversy that neither side wanted, but neither could avoid. Under pressure from forces beyond his control, Wyatt began to understand that his survival depended not on the individual skills that had sustained him as an outlaw, but on his ability to become part of a community that operated by entirely different principles. His growth was evident in his increasing willingness to learn Apache customs, language, and spiritual beliefs. Nayeli's recovery provided opportunities for them to communicate despite the language barrier, and her gentle instruction in Apache culture revealed depths of wisdom and spiritual connection that challenged everything Wyatt thought he knew about religion and meaning. Her people's relationship with the desert, their understanding of family obligations, and their acceptance of spiritual mysteries all contradicted his harsh, individualistic worldview. "Your God speaks through rules and punishment," Nayeli said during one of their conversations, her English improving daily as his Apache expanded. "Our spirits speak through connection and balance. Perhaps both are true." Wyatt's transformation was most evident in his relationship with the Apache children, who showed no fear of the legendary outlaw but saw only a man who had saved one of their own. Their acceptance taught him that identity could be chosen rather than inherited, and that family bonds could transcend blood, culture, and even law. The situation reached a critical point when Marshal Clayton's demands escalated beyond legal extradition to threats of military action if the Apache didn't surrender Wyatt voluntarily. The marshal's frustration with tribal resistance had transformed a law enforcement matter into a potential armed conflict, with implications far beyond one outlaw's fate. "You have 24 hours to produce the prisoner," Clayton warned during his final meeting with Taizé. "After that, I'll return with federal troops and treat this as an act of war against the United States government." The threat forced the Apache to choose between protecting their new family member and risking destruction of their entire way of life. The decision would test not just their commitment to Wyatt, but their ability to maintain their independence against overwhelming federal power. Wyatt realized that his presence had made the Apache village a target for forces that could destroy everything they had built over generations. His choice was becoming clear: surrender himself to save the people who had given him sanctuary, or stay and fight beside them against impossible odds. The most ominous development was the arrival of additional bounty hunters who had learned of the Marshal's ultimatum and were positioning themselves to collect the reward regardless of federal authority or Apache resistance. The peaceful canyon was becoming a battlefield where multiple groups with conflicting interests would soon collide. And then Wyatt faced the moment that would define not just his own fate, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be part of a family worth dying for. The crisis exploded when Marshal Clayton returned at dawn with 20 federal troops and a howitzer, positioning his forces to shell the Apache village if Wyatt wasn't surrendered immediately. The overwhelming show of force was designed to prevent resistance, but it also demonstrated the federal government's willingness to destroy an entire community to capture one outlaw. "This is your final warning," Clayton shouted across the canyon. "Send out the prisoner or we'll come in and take him. Your people have 1 hour to decide." To inside the village, the decision was agonizing. Taizé's authority as spiritual leader was being tested by a crisis that threatened everyone under his protection. Some Apache warriors favored immediate surrender to save the community. Others insisted that honor demanded they protect their sacred son-in-law regardless of consequences. "I won't let your people die for me," Wyatt told Taizé, his hands already moving toward his weapons. "This is my fight, and I'll finish it my way." But Nayeli's intervention stopped him, her recovered strength evident in the fierce determination that had helped her survive her attack. "You are my husband now," she said, using English words carefully chosen for their impact. "We face this together, or we die together. There is no other way." The declaration transformed the crisis from a law enforcement action into a test of spiritual marriage that would define not just their relationship, but the Apache band's commitment to their sacred obligations in the face of potentially fatal consequences. Wyatt faced an impossible choice as federal troops prepared for assault and Apache warriors took defensive positions throughout the village. He could surrender and almost certainly face execution, or he could fight beside his new family against overwhelming odds that would likely result in the destruction of everyone he had come to love. "There has to be another way," he said to Taizé, his mind racing through alternatives that seemed increasingly desperate. "What if I challenged Clayton to single combat, old law, winner takes all?" The suggestion reflected Wyatt's growing understanding of Apache culture, where individual combat could resolve disputes that would otherwise require warfare. But Clayton was a federal officer operating under military authority, not a warrior bound by codes of honor that transcended legal jurisdiction. Nayeli's response revealed the depth of her commitment to their spiritual marriage. "If you die, I die with you. If you live, we live together. The spirits have chosen our path. We cannot change it by running from what they have decreed." Her acceptance of shared fate forced Wyatt to confront the reality that his decision would determine not just his own survival, but the survival of the woman whose life he had saved and the community that had given both of them sanctuary. The choice was no longer between freedom and captivity, but between family and isolation, between spiritual obligation and self-preservation. "Then we make our stand here," Wyatt decided, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had finally found something worth dying for. "If they want me, they'll have to come through all of us." The turning point came when Wyatt realized that his reputation as a gunfighter could be used as a psychological weapon against federal forces who were prepared for military action, but not for facing a legendary outlaw in his element. His plan was audacious. In its simplicity, challenge the federal authority not through violence, but through the kind of individual confrontation that the frontier understood and respected. "Marshal Clayton!" Wyatt shouted across the canyon, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "You want me? Come and take me yourself, man to man. No troops, no artillery, just you and me settling this the way it should be settled." The challenge put Clayton in an impossible position. Accepting meant facing one of the most dangerous men in the territory in single combat. Refusing meant appearing cowardly in front of his own men and the Apache warriors who were watching for signs of federal weakness. But Wyatt's real strategy was more complex than simple gunfighter bravado. By personalizing the conflict, he was forcing Clayton to choose between his role as a federal officer and his identity as a frontier lawman. The challenge would be decided not by military superiority, but by individual courage and skill. The Apache warriors' response was immediate and supportive, their war cries echoing across the canyon as they recognized the kind of individual combat that their own culture honored. Wyatt had found a way to bridge the gap between Apache and American concepts of honorable conflict. What happened next would prove that some battles are won not through superior firepower, but through the courage to risk everything for the people who have chosen to stand beside you. The single combat between Wyatt and Marshal Clayton was arranged according to frontier tradition. With both men armed with sidearms and positioned 50 paces apart in the center of the canyon, the federal troops and Apache warriors formed a circle around the combatants, their mutual respect for individual courage temporarily overriding their political conflicts. Wyatt's preparation was both physical and spiritual. Drawing on 8 years of gunfighter experience while embracing the Apache beliefs about spiritual protection that Nayeli had taught him, he wore a small medicine bag she had prepared, its contents blessed by her father according to traditions that stretched back generations. "The spirits will guide your hand," Tassé said as he performed a brief ceremony over Wyatt's weapons. "You fight not just for yourself, but for the balance between our peoples and the sacred obligations that bind families together." Clayton's preparation was purely tactical. Checking his weapons and reviewing the military protocols that governed his authority, his confidence was based on federal backing and professional training. But his understanding of the stakes was limited to law enforcement rather than the spiritual and cultural forces that Wyatt now represented. The moment before the gunfight carried weight that extended far beyond the personal conflict between two men. The outcome would determine not just Wyatt's fate, but the federal government's relationship with the Apache band and the validity of spiritual marriages that crossed cultural boundaries. You don't have to die today. Clayton called across the distance separating them. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee you a fair trial in Tucson. Wyatt's response carried the conviction of someone who had finally found his purpose. I'm already home, Marshal. This is where I belong, and this is where I'll stay one way or another. The exchange revealed the fundamental difference in their motivations. Clayton was fighting to uphold federal law and advance his career. Wyatt was fighting to protect a family and a way of life that had given him meaning for the first time in his adult life. The tension was unbearable as both men prepared to draw, their hands hovering over their weapons while Apache drums began a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of everyone present. The gunfight lasted less than 3 seconds, but its impact would resonate for generations. Clayton drew first, his military training giving him a slight advantage in reaction time. But Wyatt's 8 years as an outlaw had honed his skills to a level that transcended normal human capabilities. Both guns fired simultaneously, their reports echoing across the canyon like thunder. Clayton's shot went wide. Thrown off by nervous tension and the psychological pressure of facing a legendary gunfighter, Wyatt's bullet found its mark with the precision that had made him famous throughout the territory. The marshal fell instantly, his death releasing the Apache village from the immediate threat of federal retaliation while simultaneously making Wyatt a more wanted man than ever before. The victory was complete but Pyrrhic, solving one problem while creating potentially greater ones. The complexity of Wyatt's victory became apparent when the federal troops, leaderless and uncertain of their authority, faced the choice between retreat and escalation. Their sergeant, a veteran of Indian wars, understood that attacking the Apache village now would mean fighting not just for law enforcement, but for revenge against the man who had killed their commanding officer. "We came for one outlaw," Sergeant Murphy told his men, "not to start a war with the Apache, but that man just killed a federal marshal in front of witnesses. We can't let that stand." The standoff continued as both sides assessed their options. The Apache had won the immediate confrontation, but federal reinforcements would inevitably arrive to either arrest Wyatt or destroy the village that had given him sanctuary. Nayeli's intervention at this critical moment transformed the situation from military standoff to diplomatic negotiation. Her fluent English and understanding of both cultures making her the bridge between two worlds that seemed destined for conflict. The decisive moment came when Nayeli stepped forward to address both the federal troops and her own people, speaking as Wyatt's wife and Taze's daughter with authority that both cultures could recognize and respect. "This man came to our people as a stranger and became our family through sacred law," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "He fought to protect us not as an outlaw, but as our son and husband. The spirits have blessed this union, and we will not surrender him to laws that do not recognize what is sacred." Her speech transformed the conflict from a simple law enforcement matter into a test of religious freedom and cultural sovereignty that neither side was prepared to handle through violence. The federal troops found themselves facing not just Apache resistance, but a spiritual marriage that challenged their understanding of legal authority. Sergeant Murphy's response was pragmatic rather than ideological. "Ma'am, I respect your customs, but that man is wanted for murder in 5 states. Federal law doesn't recognize Apache marriage ceremonies, and my orders were clear. But the sergeant's practical concerns were overruled by a higher authority when Colonel James Patterson arrived with additional troops and a telegram from Washington that changed everything about the situation. The breakthrough came when Colonel Patterson revealed that Wyatt's killing of Marshal Clayton had been witnessed by a newspaper correspondent whose account would reach national readers within days. The federal government faced a public relations crisis that required diplomatic solutions rather than military ones. Washington wants this resolved without further bloodshed. Patterson announced to both sides, "The President has authorized me to offer a full pardon for all past crimes in exchange for Mr. Kane's agreement to serve as a liaison between the Apache bands and the territorial government." The offer transformed Wyatt from wanted outlaw to potential federal employee. His knowledge of both frontier survival and Apache culture making him valuable to a government struggling to maintain peace with indigenous peoples. His marriage to Naeli became not just a personal relationship, but a political alliance that could benefit both communities. Wyatt's acceptance of the government's offer marked his complete transformation from solitary outlaw to community leader. His personal redemption serving as a bridge between two cultures that had been in conflict for generations. The immediate result was Wyatt's legal transformation from wanted criminal to federal liaison. His pardon, signed personally by President Hayes, and his new position carrying authority to negotiate between Apache bands and territorial officials. His marriage to Naeli was formally recognized by both Apache spiritual law and federal civil authority. The village that had risked everything to protect their sacred son-in-law became a model for peaceful coexistence between indigenous peoples and American settlers, with Wyatt serving as translator, mediator, and living proof that cultural barriers could be overcome through mutual respect and understanding. But the true measure of Wyatt's transformation would be seen not in government recognition or public acclaim, but in the quiet moments of family life that had given meaning to a man who had spent years believing he was beyond redemption. Wyatt's transformation from outlaw to federal liaison created immediate changes in how the U.S. government approached relations with Apache bands throughout the Southwest. His success in preventing warfare through cultural understanding and personal relationships became a model for peaceful resolution of conflicts that had previously been settled only through violence. The recognition of his marriage to Naeli established legal precedent for cross-cultural unions, providing protection for other relationships that bridge the gap between indigenous and settler communities. Their partnership became a symbol of how love could transcend cultural boundaries when based on mutual respect and shared values. Within the Apache community, Wyatt's acceptance as sacred husband validated their spiritual laws while demonstrating that outsiders could become genuine family members when they embraced tribal customs and obligations. His integration into Apache life encouraged other bands to consider peaceful accommodation with settlers who showed similar respect for indigenous ways. The Kane Protocol became standard practice for federal negotiations with Apache bands, emphasizing cultural liaison officers who could bridge communication gaps and prevent misunderstandings that had historically led to violence. Wyatt's success inspired similar programs with other tribal groups throughout the American West. His children with Nayeli grew up bilingual and bicultural, serving as living bridges between Apache and American societies. They became leaders in both communities, using their dual heritage to advance understanding and cooperation between peoples who had been enemies for generations. The peaceful resolution of the Clayton Crisis influenced federal Indian policy for decades, demonstrating that military force was not the only solution to conflicts between indigenous peoples and American expansion. Wyatt's example showed that individuals could change the course of history through personal transformation and cultural bridge building. The Apache band's survival and prosperity under federal protection provided a model for other indigenous communities seeking to maintain their traditional ways while adapting to American legal and economic systems. Wyatt's evolution from godless outlaw to respected community leader was complete but never taken for granted. Each day brought new opportunities to prove his commitment to the Apache way of life and his responsibility as husband, father, and cultural mediator. His relationship with Nayeli deepened through shared challenges and mutual growth, their marriage becoming a partnership that honored both Apache spiritual traditions and the practical demands of cross-cultural leadership. Their love story became legendary throughout the territory, inspiring other couples who faced similar cultural barriers. The man who had once trusted no one and loved nothing discovered that family bonds created strength rather than vulnerability, and that serving others provided meaning that individual achievement could never match. Wyatt Kane's transformation proved that redemption was possible for anyone willing to embrace love over fear, community over isolation, and service over self-interest. His story demonstrated that the strongest bonds were forged not through shared culture, but through shared values, and that sometimes the most unlikely unions created the most powerful foundations for building bridges between divided worlds. Sometimes a man must lose everything he thought he was to discover who he was always meant to become.